everyone, and welcome back to the Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly podcast. I'm Jake Wynn, and I am flying solo on this particular episode. I am thrilled to share this conversation that I recently had with sportswriter and author David Fleming about his book, Breaker Boys, the NFL's Greatest Team and the Stolen 1925 Championship. That book was originally published in 2007 and was re-released with a special 100th anniversary edition in 2025. The book tells the story of the 1925 NFL season, focuses on the upstart team from a small city in Pennsylvania's anthracite coalfields, the Pottsville Maroons. They took the fledgling NFL by storm and won the 1925 NFL championship before being stripped of that title and becoming a footnote in the history of professional football. David Fleming took that story and brought it to life with his book. If you're interested, after hearing this interview, which I think is quite incredible, in the book, you will find that link to that in the show notes for the episode, and be sure to go out and pick up a copy. This story is truly remarkable. And it has a really important place in my own memory as a kid growing up with a love for football in the coal region. It shared the story of this remarkable team, and most importantly for me, shared what it was like to live and support the Pottsville Maroons in 1925 in the coal region. It's a really turbulent time in the area, and we talk a little bit about that in the episode. David Fleming is the author of 4 books and was nominated for a Peabody Award in 2025 as a correspondent for Meadowlark Media. This was a really fun interview for me, and David was a great guest, and I think you are going to enjoy this episode too. But before we jump into the interview itself, I want to make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast so you get all the latest episodes, and make sure you rate and review the podcast wherever you are listening and share it with your friends as well. All that being said, now it's time for the interview with David Fleming. All right. Hello, everybody. And I am here with a guest that I'm very excited to share with all of you this conversation. I'm here with writer David Fleming. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's nice to see you face to face.
Yeah, it's been great just to be able to correspond with you over the last about a month or so, and kind of get this interview in the works and work with you a little bit to help promote the book Breaker Boys about the Pottsville Maroons on the 100th anniversary of their stolen 1925 championship. And it really is, I was saying this before we jumped onto the recording, but it really is a delight to have you on, because you're somebody who I always admired for the work you did to share the story of the Pottsville Maroons, the story that we're going to dive into in detail this evening. But again, thank you so much for being here and for your work on the Pottsville Maroons. It's a story that I think is really going to resonate with everyone listening.
Yeah, my pleasure. And there must be something special about that place, the place you call home originally. Because the book came out, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. So I just can't get Pottsville or the Breaker Boys sort of out of my system.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that that's the case, because I think this story is one that is, interesting not just to those listeners out there who may be from northeastern Pennsylvania, which I know is a lot of the audience for, a lot of the writing that I've done and some of the podcasting as well. But I think this is a story that is just, it has so many different layers to it and ways to interest a whole swath of people, whether they are interested in the history of, the 1920s, if they're interested in the history of American football. And I think it's all of those stories kind of coming together that make this a really special story, and one that has resonated for, a century, since this is the events of the book have taken place. I do want to share just a little bit, my experience with the Pottsville Maroons, which is, I grew up about 20 miles west of Pottsville, and, Pottsville was the place I went to the city. It's a community where I went to the mall, if we had to get shopping done. I played sports there as well, and I would always go by what is now a shopping center that was labeled with a sign that said Minersville Park, and it told the story of a football stadium that was once there on site. And it always caught my interest as a kid. And then your book came out in 2007, and I feel like it brought all of this energy that was, local energy that was preserving the legacy of this football team from the 1920s that had this huge national moment. But then it's largely forgotten. And football, I experience this personally. Football in that region is something that's special. I feel like it's like a little version of like what you get in places in the South. You get into Texas where high school football is everything. And I think that there's this little pocket of Pennsylvania has that level of passion for the sport. And I feel like the Pottsville Maroons played a little bit of a part in that, in that love and passion for football. So, who were the Pottsville Maroons? I've talked a little bit about them, but who were they? And, what was going on in the 1920s with American football?
Yeah, I think I think if this were just a football story, it would be fine. And if it were just a story about the Roaring Twenties, it would be fine. Or just a story about coal mining and the importance of that industry fueling the Industrial Revolution. But the fact that it's all of those things sort of that have come together in this perfect storm of a perfect season, I think that's what makes this story and this team and this town so special, and why it still sort of resonates, because it just represents so much and such an interesting moment in time. And the Pottsville Maroons sort of captured that through sports. They were, back in the 1920s, I think it's hard to put into context for people who only know the modern NFL, but I would say for maybe the first 50 years of the NFL's existence, it was a chaotic, bankrupt, corrupt mess. And no one really knew if it was going to survive literally from week to week, especially in the early years in that first decade of the 1920s. But part of the beauty of that was that towns like Pottsville, if they could raise the funds for the entrance fee, which back then was just $500, you could get into the NFL and you could test your town's best football team against the best football teams in America. And I think we're going to probably come back to this so many times, but that was sort of part of the ethos of the Roaring Twenties, where it was like, it didn't matter who you were or where you were from or how small your town was or what the industry was. Anybody could sort of take a shot at glory in any field at any moment. And that's what the Maroons did. They entered the NFL as rookies in 1925 and literally took the NFL by storm and basically beat up and humiliated every established team that people know a lot about. We're talking about the Giants, the precursor to the Eagles, the Cardinals, the Green Bay Packers. The little tiny Pottsville Maroons just slaughtered all those teams on the gridiron.
It's really it's just such an insane story. I think of a professional sports team in a town of what is just a kind of a minor county seat in the coal country of Pennsylvania is really astounding. Were there any other teams in communities like Pottsville in the 1920s?
I think the best thing, and you still hear this today, I still hear almost every interview I do, the great shame of this story is that Pottsville could have been the Green Bay of the East. And that's probably the best thing to relate it to. And even in the 1920s and 1925, the NFL was trying to get rid of small town teams. But I think Green Bay is probably the best way to relate to what Pottsville could have become. It's part of the great tragedy of this entire story. But originally, this only adds to the magic of the story. But originally, one of the reasons why the NFL agreed to let Pottsville in was that they just did it on a lark so that teams coming east to play the big money teams in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston, they could pick up an extra game in Pottsville and extra game receipts to help defray the cost of their travel. So Pottsville was sort of brought in as a joke, almost as an inside joke to sort of help defray costs for the rest of the league. Little did anybody know that they would end up, beating up every single team that came into town.
Yeah, I feel like that's definitely a Pennsylvania coal region story in terms of, this is a region, that swath of anthracite coal country that goes from my hometown, the west side of the coal region, all the way north and east through Pottsville and Schuylkill County to Hazleton, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. This is a hard-nosed place. I mean, these people made their livelihoods on back-breaking work day after day after day. They've struggled at work. They've struggled to make their lives better. They've become unionized. They have gone from 12-hour days, 6 days a week. They fought for their rights. And I feel like that translates onto the field of play as well. When these guys, whether it's the amateurs, the semi-pros, the professionals that emerged from this region, whether it's in football or other sports like baseball, these guys were tough as nails. They brought that over from their livelihood and took it on to the sports fields as well.
Oh, 100%. And there's that sort of anthracite chip on their shoulder, right? That they feel like the rest of the world outside of that region takes them for granted and doesn't really sort of respect and appreciate the fuel that they provided to the growth of America. And you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons why Pottsville joined the NFL was that their town team had been in the Anthracite Football League, but they were so good, they had sort of run out of competition. And that Pottsville's Anthracite football team was so good, they would embarrass teams in like Coaldale, and fans would chase them to the train because they were so angry about what Pottsville had done to them on the football field. And there is a real sense of, I just love the fact that Pottsville is made up, the Maroons were eventually made up, the roster was made up of some incredible free agents, some great sort of regional Pennsylvania college all-stars, but the heart and soul of the team was still men who were actual still functioning coal miners. And they bring this sense of perspective, I think, to the game of football, which is, if you think football is hard, go spend a shift, down underground for 12 hours, and it'll make you rethink how tough and how difficult football is. And I think that's the reason why I think they sort of like oblivious to pain, at least pain on like the football field, was that they had experienced real hardship, and football to them was a picnic. And it just sort of, the perspective and the context of this team, it just puts them on a whole nother level as far as sort of like the violence and the toughness and what it took, the sort of overcoming injuries to be successful at football.
So, I think of, professional football today as incredibly violent, and we have a lot of conversations about that in American life now. But I just imagine that time period as being somehow even more violent. What does the actual game look like in the 1920s?
Oh, I mean, it honestly, yeah, it looks like an organized fist fight most of the time. It was incredibly violent. It was, the players, most of them didn't wear helmets. If they wore anything, it was sort of a thin cap or a layer, a leather thing on their head. I think the ability to endure incredible pain was the number one needed characteristic of a football player, an NFL player in the 1920s. Football emerged from the sport of rugby. And you think about, you can still watch rugby scrums where it's men who are basically in shorts and t-shirts, and women, and it's just collisions, it's mass collisions at the sort of line of scrimmage. And that was very similar to what the NFL was in its early days. It was just a sort of more violent form of rugby with a slightly different shaped ball.
Yeah, that sort of makes sense, that it's like those coal region boys, they're well suited, as you've said. They're well suited for this profession.
Yeah, you get the sense that it was like somebody who may have played in college, or somebody who wasn't a coal miner would sort of take one hit from these guys and go, oh, forget it. I'll find something else to do on my weekends. And there was Tony Latone, the Maroons' best player and best running back in the NFL, probably in the entire decade of the 1920s. He would, mimicking what he used to do in the coal mines, he would run straight full speed into the line of scrimmage. And if he didn't break through, he would just back up and do it again on the same play. So he was just a sort of human battering ram. And I just can't imagine. I always think about the sounds. That's what you read about. That's the sort of the anecdotes that you hear about from back then. It was the sounds that the sport made of these sort of human collisions, of sort of like bones breaking and men sort of grunting and groaning. And that's what always, I think for me, cues in just how violent it was. It made people turn away, the sort of sounds of these collisions.
Yeah, I kind of imagine that in particular as kind of like my first experience with like UFC fighting. Where
yes,
it's just...
that's a great point. Yes. You can't look away. It's like a car crash. And it's almost, I experienced that. I went to my first fight like that a couple of months ago, and I thought the exact same thing. I was sort of sickened, but mesmerized. And it was because I'm like, this violence seems just 3 degrees above what is normal or what should be acceptable. But here I am watching nonetheless. That's a great way to compare it.
So when what were the facilities like where these guys are playing? I'm imagining just a muddy field. Is kind of just how I imagine this. But, you mentioned this kind of divide between the big city teams, and then you have the little kind of rinky dink operation like Pottsville. What kind of stadiums or places are they playing? Are there big crowds? Like what's that environment like that they're playing in?
Yeah, I mean, football was beginning to catch on, and you talk about that sort of violent entertainment. People sort of loved it from the very beginning. And it varied from town to town. Most, it was nothing like what we see today, obviously. But Pottsville, for example, they played in this sort of converted baseball stadium that was sort of dug into, sort of carved out of like a foothill. So fans and coal miners especially could, without paying, could climb up into the hill and watch down into the stadium. But the fields were muddy, they were full of coal slag, and they were sort of, again, just barbaric by today's standards. But Pottsville also did a lot of things that were groundbreaking. They practiced on a regular basis. They had their players live in town and become part of the community. They did skull sessions in front of the chalkboard, reviewing plays and designing new ones. So Pottsville was in a lot of ways way ahead of their time. You've been there, you've seen that stadium. You could just get a sense of the way it's sort of carved into that hill, that foothill, and bordered by the creek or that small river, and just, cars, if you put 10,000 people there, the cars would just be abandoned for miles in every direction. And it's nothing compared to today's sort of stadiums and sports, but in a way it's 10 times better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just so, it feels so, grassroots, and just kind of, that chaos. And that comes through in the book, where it's just, it's all kind of chaos from, from the league organization to the team operation to getting to the game to, it's just, it seems like, I mean, I can see why there was such a fascination and a love for the sport, not just in Pottsville, but I think elsewhere as well, because it's just this, like, it feels like a sensation that people are just like wanting to join and be a part of.
Yeah, and then again, you go to a town as diverse as Pottsville, with the whole town. The way to the stadium is lined with every type of religion, every ethnic sort of neighborhood, and for one day a week, those people all sort of put those divisions aside, and they all sort of march up to this makeshift stadium to cheer on their sort of champion level football team together. It was, the Maroons were, again, in many ways, really helped put the NFL on the map, and essentially for the NFL, for pro football, which people looked down upon back then, it was, college football was really what people preferred and what people thought was much more honorable. But for the NFL, Pottsville really helped define and create that idea of civic boosterism within a community for a professional football team.
Yeah, that's one thing that I loved learning about in the book, and something that I've returned to and talk about in my own research on the region, is just that level of, there is that level of civic pride that existed, and it comes through as well in your work. It's just, that time period was one of particular importance and also of particular stress for the people of Pottsville. You know, there's mine strikes going on. There's disagreements over labor with the miners. This is also a time period. This is one that I've continued to kind of return to recently, because I think it's kind of it's relevant to some stories that we're seeing in headlines today. But this is also a period of automation, and so there's electrification of the mines. There's people's jobs. That backbreaking labor is increasingly being replaced by machines that are going to be doing that work, and so there's less of a need for workers. And so what was an employer of 100,000 people across northeastern Pennsylvania in 1918, the peak of anthracite coal production, is going to begin, just that labor force is just going to continue to drop over the subsequent decades, down to where I think I just talked to some of the last deep miners in northeastern Pennsylvania just last week. I think there's like less than 24 of them left today.
Wow.
And it's, you know, this is a time period that's very stressful. So I could imagine that having something like this, having a team that becomes a sensation, would be such a force for good, something that was a rallying point that could get a whole community together. It's also a time period of prohibition, which I think is funny in that prohibition never really fully arrived in Schuylkill County as well. There's lots of stills in the hills all around. These guys are making their own, you know, the community's making their own hooch, bathtub gin. So it's just a fascinating time period, and you really help bring that to life.
It's easy to, even as an outsider, you just immediately fall in love with the people and this region. And one of the reasons why Pottsville got a team in the NFL in the first place, I forgot to mention this, was there used to be blue laws where you couldn't drink or you couldn't play sports on Sundays. But nobody dared go into the anthracite region and tell coal miners what they could do or couldn't do on their day off. And so Pottsville could do whatever they want. And so the NFL was like, oh, hey, we can play football every day of the week if we want to in Pottsville. And there is that sort of like kind of badass, like nobody tells us what to do attitude that you just kind of love, that the team took on, but that the town sort of embraced too. And it's all sort of a underlying theme of the story and of the season.
So who are some of the individuals that stand out to you, whether it be ownership, players, coaches, townspeople? Who stands out to you as you think about this story, those handful of characters that you think really drive this story?
Oh man, that is a hard question, because the thing that I love about this team is it seems like almost everybody on the roster is a once in a lifetime character. I mean, you've got Tony Latone, known as the human howitzer, regarded by men like Red Grange as the best running back and the most, and statistically the best running back of the 1920s in the NFL. He was really the star of the team, but you've got the owner is Doc Striegel, who is like, you know, the Jerry Jones of the anthracite region. Just a huge, you know, dreamer and schemer who seemed to sort of love gambling. And he was the one, I think nobody else in Pottsville thought big enough when it came to the NFL. Doc Striegel was the one who was like, we could do this. Why can't we do this? Then he hires Dick Roush, who is their coach, who also is a sort of national level renowned ornithologist. So it's like you couldn't make up these characters even if you were writing a fiction book about the NFL in the 1920s. And he takes his sort of his scientific approach to bird watching and to studying birds, and he applies that to football, as far as scouting and preparation and note taking and studying. And he sort of applies that to the Pottsville Maroons, and it gives them this, they were sort of rough and violent, but they were also really smart and really advanced on the field. And I mean, I could just keep going all day. I love Tony Latone. But then opposite of Tony Latone, you've got collegiate all-stars like Jack Ernst, who was sort of their swashbuckling, sort of perfectly cast quarterback, and his teammate Charlie Berry, and the wide receiver and kicker. And you can just really go down the roster, whether it was a coal miner, a sort of local guy, or it was a NFL sort of all-star, just one after the other. You know, they've got their punter. They had a punter who met his wife he accidentally punted the ball into the stands and it hit this woman, and that's how they met. And they ended up getting married. They had just huge linemen who just had huge appetites for gambling, for beer, for food. You know, they had one of their running backs would go on to be a dentist. It was just, again, as somebody who lives for these kinds of things, as you're peeling back the layers on this roster and this list of characters, you're just like, I cannot believe I stumbled on this story. This is truly, and I mean, I think the time has proven this. It's a once in a career, once in a lifetime story.
Yeah, it's like, you know, thinking of all these characters, it's like some kind of like alchemy. It's like they've taken all of these pieces and they've made gold, you know, whether it's from the football standpoint and the product on the field to the story that we can talk about and tell. It's like it never ends.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite? I should have asked you first if you have a favorite.
Yeah, no, I love the Doc Striegel character, and just that kind of boosterism, big ideas kind of personality. I find people like that fascinating, about how, you know, just making things happen out of seemingly nothing. And I think this is one of those. He's one of those characters.
Right. He was kind of like we'll build the plane as we're flying it. It was like, let's get in the NFL, then we'll figure out what the team is called or what the uniform colors are or how we're going to sort of pay for all this. And we'll just figure that out later. He is sort of like this classic American 1920s character. And his wife too, Neva, she ends up being sort of like the nurse and the sort of like the team psychologist. And I feel like if there ever was a movie made, she would be a much bigger character, because it sounds like she really sort of saved a lot of careers and saved the season, and she was kind of the glue to the whole team.
Yeah, that's one thing I you know, from the first time I read this, was shortly after it came out in 2007, to most recent read just this last year. It is a story that just lends itself to like, it would be good. It would be a good movie, because it's like all of those characters, and there's just so many different threads that you could pull on any individual character that you could really use to tell just an incredible story. It's almost like it's like Stranger Than Fiction kind of situation, because it's just like there's so many people that it almost feels unreal just how crazy all of these people being in one place and how diverse they were in background and interests, and yet it all seems to work.
Yeah. And the book was different production companies had bought the rights to the book for, up until maybe about like 5 or 8 years ago, it had been in that sort of like pre-production or whatever. And there was a great movie script that was produced. And in the meetings that we had originally when we were pitching it in LA, there was a lot of that, like, okay, so which one of these characters is made up? Or, surely this didn't happen. And it was like, no, this is all true. That's why it's like, don't change it. Just write it exactly as it happened. And people still won't believe it. Yeah, it is stranger than fiction.
So, the season 1925, I get the sense it's kind of just like, they start playing, they have some success, and it just kind of, the ball of momentum kind of just continues to it's kind of snowballing. Tell us a little bit about the 1925 season, how it goes for the Pottsville Maroons.
So you're right. They come out of the gate, and people understand right away, we've got something special here. This mix of like toughness from the locals and talent from all the money that Doc Striegel spent on free agents. We've got something special here. And but what adds to the sort of the tension is they lose a weird game in the rain early on. And the way that the NFL champion was determined back then for a long time was by winning percentage. And it's much like sort of the college football before the playoffs started. It was like you had to be undefeated, or if you had more than one loss, forget it. And that's kind of the way. So that adds this tension early on that Pottsville is like, well, we can't lose again, or else we'll be in danger of sort of washing out the whole season. And so early on, they have to play the Canton Bulldogs. And the Canton Bulldogs were like the New York Yankees of the early NFL season. I think they had won back-to-back titles and just dominated the league for 3 or 4 years. And that is the same week that Charlie Berry, who we talked about earlier, joined the team and was given the captaincy that same week. And sort of this idea of this magical season and everything sort of happening in a perfect storm. Charlie Berry joins, they beat Canton, and then they go on sort of an epic roll, just steamrolling everybody, the Packers, the Giants, just everybody in the NFL. And it comes down to basically what they're playing for. It's between them, the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who would eventually become the Philadelphia Eagles, and the Chicago Cardinals. And I think the way that the season is going is it's either going to be Pottsville or Frankfurt who are going to represent the sort of quote unquote East part of the NFL. And the Chicago Cardinals are clearly the class of the West. And at some point, two of those teams are going to play for the quote unquote NFL title. And so you have this, again, Pottsville and Frankfurt, they sort of hate each other because one is sort of a big city and the other one is seen as sort of this coal mining, town up in the sticks. And there's this great natural rivalry, and they go back and forth, but eventually Pottsville, when it comes down to it, Pottsville humiliates Frankfurt. I think something like 48 or 49 to nothing. And and with the whole season on the line, Pottsville, they don't just beat them, they roll up the score, they just humiliate them. And based on that win, Pottsville then agrees to travel west and play the Chicago Cardinals in Comiskey Park for what headline writers across the country we're calling the NFL title in Chicago.
And that game is, it's like an endless source of fascination to me. It's just the snowy, classic Chicago football weather. And, how we got connected was, I for the 100th anniversary of this game, I shared the account of what was going on in Pottsville at the time, which is endlessly fascinating to me. It's, obviously most of the people of Pottsville cannot afford to travel west to Chicago. So what are they going to do? But they gather into the town's theater and the hip, as they call it, the hippodrome, and they go in and they sit down and they have a telegraph and everything hooked up, and they're updating up on a big board how the game is going, and it's just hundreds of people there. It's just this, again, it's like magic. It's just, you can almost you can almost sense what it was like to be there. So that's what's going on in Pottsville. What goes on in the game in Chicago?
And I love that scene you're talking about too, right? Where again, I'm sure you've got from every stretch of Pottsville, they come together in the hip to watch the game. And I feel like that's where I think the town sent like a telegram to Charlie Berry, who then read it on the sidelines and then dictated a telegram back to the hippodrome that was like, boys are ready. We will do our best. It's, it's just sort of 100 years later, it still sort of, gives you goosebumps to imagine that scene. And again, in classic Pottsville anthracite form, Pottsville probably would have been smarter to not go to Chicago. And there was no rule that said they had to go. And they could have just kept playing, and they would have played out the string, and they would have won on the fact that they had the best winning percentage, and they would have been NFL champions. But that's not the way Pottsville does things. They were like, oh no, we want to win this on the field. We want to earn it. And Tony Latone was hurt. That was another reason why they probably would have been smarter to not even go to Chicago. But instead, at great expense, they go all the way to Chicago. There's where you're right. There's a ice and snowstorm going on in Comiskey Park, and using their backup running back, Pottsville still just absolutely pounds the Cardinals, and they end up winning the de facto NFL title 21-7. And they did it in a way, there are these great quotes from, normally I think there's bad blood or there's people like, oh, we want a rematch. But even the Cardinals and the Cardinal players and the Cardinal ownership, they were the ones singing Pottsville's praises after the game. There are these great quotes about, from the Cardinals and from Chicago fans that was like, there's no doubt that Pottsville is the king of the 1925 NFL. And so then you have this great scene that matches, I think, the scene in the hip where Pottsville then gets back on a train, and as they're sort of moving east back towards Pottsville, they're picking up fans. They're picking up people who used to live in Pottsville that jump on the train, and it becomes this sort of party, this sort of like victory parade, until they finally pull into Pottsville, and where's the scene of this like epic celebration as Pottsville realizes they've been put on the map by their NFL championship team.
Yeah, it's scenes that I can, I've read them. I've gone through all the newspapers, the time period, and it's jubilation. It's, they have put themselves into the national headlines. People are reading about Pottsville, and it's not about a mine strike or a mine disaster. It's about a success. It's about a story of that team coming together and proving everyone wrong.
Yeah, and I one of the Nick Barbetta was one of the last living eyewitnesses to the team and to that season, and I'm sure he was in his 90s when I talked to him, and he was just incredible and incredibly gracious. But I remember the first time I asked him about the team train coming back, cutting through the valley and sort of coming into view, and again, close to 100 years later, Nick remembered being a child waiting on the platform, and he reflexively just put his hands over his ears because he was like, it was so loud. He's like, the noise, I've never heard anything like it, whether it was the end of wars or the end of mining strikes or anything. He's like, that's the loudest I've ever heard this town, people cheering for the Maroons.
Yeah, incredible scenes. But things are going to go awry here. I'm going to mire all of this in controversy. So what happens next?
So I think one of the reasons why Frankfurt was so angry and so upset by being humiliated by the Maroons wasn't necessarily the NFL title, but teams back then made most of their money and tried to break even by adding games at the end of the season, whether it was against maybe like a an all-star team or, another, they would add games until their numbers evened out. And what was in the works was the best NFL team on the East was going to play an exhibition game against the famous, the iconic Notre Dame, an all-star team made up of the Notre Dame Four Horsemen. And this was a watershed moment in NFL history because nobody thought any collection of pro football players could stay anywhere close or even belonged on the same field as the Notre Dame Four Horsemen. And so what happens is the Maroons, they crush Frankfurt and thereby winning the opportunity to play the Cardinals, but also the opportunity to play Notre Dame in a huge game in Philadelphia, which surely is going to be worth, tens of thousands of dollars for their front office. And Frankfurt then, when they realize that they've missed out on this, they immediately then try to protest and say, well, that game is going to be in our quote unquote territory. And so Frankfurt, being one of the sort of old school NFL teams, and, have to remember too, that the rest of the NFL secretly didn't really appreciate being humiliated and beaten up by this no-name team from this no-name town in Northeast Pennsylvania. And so the Maroons had sort of, instead of they had gained a lot of fans, but they had gained a lot of enemies too, especially amongst the NFL, the power brokers of the NFL. And so even though there was no rule on the books for territories, the NFL, and we could spend a whole podcast going back and forth on this, but the Maroons called and say that they got permission to play the game. And when they got that permission, they signed the contract to play Notre Dame. And then even though they were threatened by Frankfurt and by the league office with suspension, they said, absolutely not. We're not going to go back on our word. We already got permission. We're playing this game. And on top of that, it's like, we want to earn it. If people are going to call us world champions, bring on the best team you can, and we want to prove it on the field. So even they were told that they would get suspended, Pottsville goes ahead with this iconic game in Philadelphia against the Notre Dame Four Horsemen college all-star team.
Yeah, it's a murky story about how it gets to that point. So what happens in that game, in this kind of unprecedented matchup between these Notre Dame and college all-stars and the Pottsville Maroons?
Yeah, and again, I'm trying to put it into proper context for people, but it would be like a Penn State, a satellite campus of Penn State, their football team playing the Buffalo Bills and beating the Buffalo Bills, right? Or beating the New England Patriots. And that's what happened. People showed up expecting just, 50-0 by Notre Dame. And Pottsville, and this is a really important part of the story, is that Pottsville, by not backing down and by playing this game even under threat of suspension, they not just hold their own against Notre Dame, which no one thought was possible. They end up beating Notre Dame on this incredible late drive powered by Tony Latone, the coal miner, and then one on the foot of Charlie Berry, who kicks the game-winning field goal as time expires and literally sets the football and the sports world on its ear. Because all of a sudden now people are like, oh, wait a second, the NFL is legit. If a team of NFL players can beat the Notre Dame Four Horsemen, maybe we should pay attention and give that league more respect. And for doing that, for helping to put the NFL on the map and for bringing respect to the fledgling NFL, in return, the NFL followed through and suspended Pottsville and then essentially made them ineligible for the championship title that they had won on the field in Chicago. So a week or 10 days after celebrating what they thought was an NFL championship, the NFL took it away from them. And that's why we're talking still 100 years later is, this town and fans in this region have been fighting for a century to bring that title back.
So that's something we talk a lot about, memory on this podcast, about how things are remembered and how that evolves over time. So I know you kind of pick up this story at a really interesting point with your work in the 2000s, but can you kind of, for listeners, kind of like, how did what happens to the Maroons after the championship, and then how does this story live on? And I know it gets picked up on in the later 20th century by people involved with the NFL later. Share a little bit of that story.
Yeah, there ends up being, I think what happened is in context, right? First of all, Pottsville really assumed, they were like, well, back then an NFL championship didn't really mean all that much. And people weren't sure the NFL was going to last till 1928. And so I understand why they were sort of, nobody didn't fight right away with like court injunctions and all that stuff. They were like, oh, well, we'll win another one in 1926. But they had no way of knowing that the NFL would grow to be what it is today. And so it just sort of kind of got pushed aside. But I think it's a really important note that when they tried to award the championship to the Cardinals, they wouldn't take it, because they were like, well, we clearly got beaten fair and square on the field. We can't accept this trophy. So technically the 1925 NFL championship was never awarded, or never officially awarded. And so it just sort of, it was just one of those things that just kind of, it was never really kind of decided one way or the other for decades, until the Cardinals moved, I think, to St. Louis, or it was sort of like the next generation of that, the Bidwill ownership family. I honestly get the feeling that they were sort of looking through their books and they were like, oh, wait a second. It looks like we were the 1925 NFL champions. And they just sort of, they're the ones who sort of took it and ran with it. And then it wasn't until the 1960s when the NFL and pro football started thinking about putting together, they started formalizing the records, formalizing all the standings and all that stuff. And they were raising money to build the Hall of Fame. And that's when people in Pottsville were kind of like, we've got a lot of artifacts and a lot of stuff, and we'll give them to you if you give us back the championship that you've stolen. And then again, for half a century, it becomes this he said, she said, back and forth. And as the NFL grows in power, Pottsville's chances at justice sort of shrink and shrink and shrink until, the turn of the century.
So how did you get involved in this story? How did you learn about the Pottsville Maroons, and what made you decide to tell this story?
I have been all over the map and talking way too much, but I finally gave you a really nice segue right there, because at the turn of the century, Pottsville made one last push to petition the NFL to get their championship back. And actually they really thought that they had made progress with NFL owners, and they had proposed that they share the title, which isn't completely fair, but it's an acceptable compromise. And it just so happened, I think it was the 2003 NFL owners meeting. I was there covering the meetings for something else, and I noticed they used to hand out a 1-page agenda for reporters to tell you what the league would be talking about that day. And I was there for something else. I think it was rules related. And I just happened over breakfast to read this agenda and was like, the mayor of Pottsville, Pennsylvania will seek to get their 1925 title reinstated. And I was like, what is this? And, that was 3 years ago. And it was, again, it was one of those, so it was one single agenda item. And here we are, 2 decades later, still talking about it.
So what were your, I know you came into the region and did, some great research and work and talking to people who experienced this firsthand as well. What was your perception of Pottsville when you were going there on research, and what people thought about this story?
I think after a really short amount of time, I just absolutely fell in love with the place. And part of that was the rude reception I got early on, because people were protective. And you go to a lot of towns, people don't, I've written other history books. People, it's so hard to get people to care and to protect and honor and sort of, keep history alive. Not in Pottsville. It was the opposite. It was like, what are you doing here? What do you, it's like, they didn't like, at the very beginning, they did not like that one of their own was not going to be telling this story. And they were very skeptical and very guarded, but that kind of made me like respect and really like them. And I think over time, after the 10th, 11th, 12th time you show up in town, and the town is small enough that people knew when I was there, I think they were like, okay, this guy's serious and he's going to do he's going to do it justice, and he's putting the work in, and he's calling everybody. He's calling aunts and uncles and cousins, and he's not leaving any stone unturned. And eventually I proved myself to them. And once I did that, I was just embraced, and really one of the highlights of my career, to be sort of accepted and helped by that community. And when the book came out, it was just an amazing experience, and the kind of support that authors and historians sort of dream about at times 1,000. So just one of the highlights of, to this day still, of my career and my life.
It's incredible. And I'm glad you had that experience. It's one that, working as a historian, I am from the region. However, it is very territorial. So it's like I could go into Pottsville and I'm like, not technically from Schuylkill County. I'm from the adjacent county. So I get where is Williamstown and why are you here? Starting to get past that now. But if you go up to like Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, you get kind of the same, I get kind of the same treatment. So I know what you're talking about, but I'm glad they warmed up to you, and it helped to, give you material for an incredible story. I will say I remember my first time seeing the book physically, which was going into the mall in a bookstore in the mall in Frackville, Pennsylvania, just north of Pottsville. And there was a bookstore there, and they had a huge elaborate display of your book at the front of the store. And that's where I remember being like, I know Breaker Boys, and Breaker Boys, the title of the book, is like this iconic, I would call it profession. It's child labor in the region where the kids would separate coal from slate in the mines. And I was like, I know what a breaker boy is. And then I was like, 1925 stolen NFL championship. And I was like, immediately, I need to read this book. And yeah, I'm so glad that I did. It was fuel for me, just as I was getting very interested in local history. It was kind of like, here is this writer with a national background experience, who's done all kinds of amazing things, and he's writing about essentially adjacent to my hometown, and I was just riveted by that, and it helped to fuel my fire for looking for these stories and unearthing all the other times that coal region history has intersected with national events or has been in the national spotlight. So
I'll tell you. Well, thank you. I mean, and that means so much. And that is one of the things that differentiated signings and events in Pottsville from other books that I've had, is that people literally were bringing 10 books at a time. And it was like, this is for grandma, this is for grandpa, this is for my nephew who lives in Arizona. It's like, oh my God, the pride in the region, and the generational wanting to pass down that pride, even to people who maybe don't live there anymore. Or it's a powerful thing that I think the Maroons have really tapped into and helped keep alive. I'll tell you a great story that I got close to finishing the book, and I was sort of explaining to my editor what we had just talked about, how it was like, well, people have really embraced me and this project, and people are offering help and lodging, and I mean, it's really just been incredible. And my editor was like, well, what's it like down in a coal mine? And I was like, I don't know. And he goes, stop what you're doing. You cannot write this. You can't finish this book unless you've been down in a coal mine. And I was kind of like, no, I think I can. It's fine. And he goes,
I'm good.
Yeah. he's like, get your ass up to Pottsville and get down into a coal mine. He's like, you absolutely have to do that before you try to write this book. And I did it, and it changed me. It changed the book entirely. And it was the best thing to ever happen to the book and to the research. That trip down into, I hope it's still there, that it's an old mine that they've turned into like a little historic thing, and you can ride down in there and experience what it feels like. And I did that, and it was, I got, a guy took me down by myself, and that made, I don't know if he does this for everyone, but we got down there, we got out of the cart, we walk around, and without telling me, he turned the lights off.
Yep.
And I basically, I mean, I was just like, oh my gosh, it really solidified for me sort of the respect and the way the book needed to honor the men who made their living. I couldn't stand 10 seconds. And they're, like you said, they're down there for 10 hours. And oh my God, I went home and just reorganized the book, and really sort of, it opens now down in a coal mine. That was some of the best writing advice I had ever gotten.
Yeah, that is a wild experience. I've done numerous trips down in. I have some goal of getting into one of those last remaining working mines for project I want to do in the future as well. I'm looking for that experience and just hearing those guys talk and work and what it's like. But yeah, it's that first time that I had that experience too, and turning the lights off. For me, it was a different experience because I come from generations of people who did that work. And it, for me, was, it was terrifying when the lights go off, and it's total, like, it's dark, but advanced darkness. It's terrifying.
It is.
But it was this connecting moment for me to my heritage, to my history, to my ancestors who went down in mines like that day after day after day for their entire lives until it either wounded them too grievously or killed them or left them with lifelong disabilities. But there was always a passion about their work and a passion about that craft that still is passed down. And I still get that sense of, there is a pride there. In some cases, it comes out in civic pride about community, but it really exists about the history there, whether it's the mining history, the labor history, the military service of the people that came from there, and especially the sports history. And it really comes through. And I think that's part of why that love for the Pottsville Maroons and that passion for that story that you saw, why that came out.
Yeah, I think the enduring love and fight for the Maroons it's enduring love and fight for the region, right? The Maroons are just a metaphor for a forgotten and unfairly treated, important part of this country. I think I've only just now sort of started to understand that and appreciate it.
Well, Dave, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Public History Podcast and chatting about this for almost an hour now. And it's been a ton of fun. This has been an honor having you on the podcast, and thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thanks for all your help with continuing to get the story out and all your support of the book too. It's been there has been a resurgence around the 100th anniversary that you and your site have been a big part of. And I feel like those things really, they all help keep the story alive, which is really all that matters. So thank you.
Absolutely. And listeners, you can go down into the show notes and you can get your own copy of the 100th anniversary edition of Breaker Boys. And you can read about this story and in all of its incredible layers, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So again, thanks, Dave, for coming on.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Public History with Justin, Jake, and Molly podcast. I hope you enjoyed that interview with David Fleming. I know I enjoyed our discussion and talking about a story that I was familiar with as a kid growing up in the coal region of Pennsylvania, and was delighted to be able to share it with all of you. Be sure to click the link in our show notes to go pick up your own copy of Breaker Boys and the 100th anniversary edition that did come out in 2025. If you enjoyed this episode and our show, please rate and review the podcast and share it with some fellow history fans out there. This has been Jake Wynn. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we will talk with you again soon.